We talked about the Industrial Revolution and all of the great changes, great not necessarily meaning like good, but big. So drastic changes, how about that word? Drastic changes taking place because of industrialization. So between 1850 and 1870, we see innovations from the Industrial Revolution spreading across the West. And after 1870, technology continued to advance, making what historians call the Second Industrial Revolution. Steel was a major factor in the expansion of industry. It was mostly used for tools and machinery, and by 1914, steel production increased by 50 times. Great advances in chemistry allowed manufacturers to dye cloth inexpensively. They could process wood pulp into paper more efficiently. Germany led the way in chemistry at this time, giving it an edge over Britain as the leader of industrial Europe. This is the first time that that's happened. This is kind of a big deal. Electricity became commonplace after 1914, giving way to new inventions like refrigerators and vacuum cleaners. In 1844, the telegraph system was established by Samuel Morse, and in the 1870s, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. The use of railroads had spread all over the world by this time, and people began looking for even more efficient ways to transport goods. So steamships fully replaced sailing ships. The Suez Canal, built in 1869 in the Mediterranean, and the Panama Canal, built in 1914 between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, fully connected the Western world with everyone else. The automobile was also introduced at this time. The first gasoline-powered automobile was invented by a German man named Carl Benz. Does that sound familiar? Mercedes-Benz, anyone? 2 decades later, American Henry Ford introduced the assembly line to the automobile industry, making vehicle production faster and making vehicles more affordable. So by 1914, there were traffic jams in major cities across the West. This is a huge leap. For working class men and women, working really hadn't changed that much since the start of industrialization. The pay was low. Jobs were not very safe. The thought of having your rights protected just really wasn't there. A worker, for example, could lose money for being a few minutes late, or they could lose their jobs if they complained about their wages being shortened. And often, workers had to use what little pay they received to provide their own equipment at work. And I think I mentioned this in the previous lecture. Like, for example, if you're a seamstress, you might have to buy your own needles. It was even a common practice among employers to lock exits to keep employees from working without taking unauthorized breaks, or to keep them from stealing things. There were a couple of major labor unions that began working to ensure that workers' rights were protected. Some of them included the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, the Women's Trade Union League, and one that we've already discussed, the American Federation of Labor. American unions began organizing in the late 1700s, but they really didn't pick up steam until the mid-1800s. Unions didn't really make any changes for the better until the late 1800s and early 1900s. And sadly, improvements really only came after tragedy struck. So, for example, on March 25th, 1911, we have the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City catching fire, and we see the death of over 100 women and girls. The exits were locked, so 146 women and girls working at the factory died either from the fire or smoke inhalation, and some of them, they died by jumping to the sidewalk, either like from the 8th, from the 9th, or the 10th floors. And after this happened, legislation was passed to improve the safety standards in factories. Another something that's kind of interesting during this time, we talked about the spread, the expansion, the development of journalism, and you can see here the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire has a very good example of what's called yellow journalism. And this is journalism that exploits, distorts, or exaggerates the news to create sensations as well as to attract readers. So this photograph from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was double exposed. So some of these bodies that are down here, these are bodies of the women that fell. these women were not actually there. They were on the opposite side of the street. But the idea was, look at all these men who are just standing around and looking up at the burning fire with these women lying dead at their feet. You know, it's like, wow, it's pretty intense, right? So, so we see yellow journalism very much at work, helping, in many ways, the unions to get their point across, and ultimately, eventually helping them with seeing reform come to fruition. So it's kind of obvious that there's both good and bad things that come from this time. And we see that in every area, including in the sciences and in art. So, in the arts, Impressionism rose to acclaim with painters like Claude Monet. These paintings show the idyllic landscape from the first impression the artist would take in. They're fairly happy scenes that one could tell was of a painting of houses or of flowers. The painting that's on the right there, you can tell that's a bridge over water. But they weren't necessarily picture perfect, as it were, of the scene before them. Again, it's an impression of what they see. Expressionism, on the other hand, really was art for art's sake. It was a little more pessimistic, maybe, in some ways. There were lots of people who did not understand the meaning behind the paintings. One famous example of an expressionist painting is The Scream by Edvard Munch. He once said, "How much of my art I owe to suffering." Expressionism was used largely to express the bad feelings of the time, such as depression, entrapment, and anger. Albert Einstein began studying physics during this time, and he developed the theory of relativity and also produced the groundbreaking formula of E equals mc squared. This formula and his discoveries would eventually lead to the development of the atomic bomb. One great advancement in the medical field was Louis Pasteur's discovery of bacteria. Pasteur gave the world the germ theory. Now we know, why do people get sick? It's because of germs. And with this discovery, doctors and scientists alike were able to create vaccines against deadly and crippling diseases like polio or the measles. So this is huge. Another scientist gained fame for a controversial theory of the origin of life on Earth. Charles Darwin. He studied medicine and theology, but he loved studying plants and animals. In 1831, Darwin took a trip around the world as a naturalist. On this trip, he began to develop the theory of evolution. Not everybody accepted his theories, but there were several who saw his idea of the survival of the fittest as an explanation even to human issues. So philosophers and scholars expanded on Darwin's thesis and applied it to human behavior and called it social Darwinism, as I mentioned in a previous lecture. Darwin's thoughts led to people promoting the idea of improving humanity by way of eugenics or selective breeding. So to give you an example, eugenics was very popular in the United States, and in fact there are American eugenicists who traveled to Germany, and they kind of help Hitler's final solution. And the idea is you take the undesirables of society and you either kill them or you sterilize them so they are no longer able to reproduce. So what makes a person undesirable? Well, if you think that your race is superior than others, then it's going to be any race that is not yours, right? So in the United States, we see Native Americans forcibly sterilized, African Americans injected with STDs. We see poor children, because this is not just relegated to race, this is also, it includes class as well. So if you are a poor street urchin, like if you're an orphan on the street, or just a poor child on the street, if you are mentally handicapped, or if you're physically handicapped, all of that are grounds to consider you inferior. And so in the eugenicist mind, so like the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, an exact quote from Margaret Sanger is one of the best things you can do for a child is to kill it. The idea being you should not bring certain children into the world. So we see abortion beginning to increase during this time as well. So lots of different ideas coming about. Some of them, once again, quite good. Others of them not so good. With eugenics, one nation that we see using Darwin's theory of evolution and the doctrine of social Darwinism is Nazi Germany. And we also know that the debate over Darwinism rages on even today. Okay, so now that we're done with progress, it was a very short sort of blip into this particular part of life. Next time we're going to get into World War I.